Defining marginality. Defining marginality, Jonathan Crew and Dartmouth College. Jonathan Crew from Dartmouth College. Title of the conference held in 1989. Redefining marginality. Focused attention on the condition of marginality, of being marginalized. My own concern is not, however, with the marginal condition as such, but with the related question of the discourse of the marginal, or that articulated from the margins. Briefly, I shall suggest that redefinition of this new entrenched discourse might well include consideration of its limits as well as its power. Like any other critical discourse, it is no less threatened by debilitating over application or repetition than by containment. In pursuing this question of limits, I shall take example mainly from my own field of Renaissance literature and criticism. To begin with, however, I want to retrace a few steps in development of our current discourse of the marginal. Where are we and how did we get here? Historically, our discourse of the marginal can be seen as one response to widespread political violence done during the 60s and early 70s, and as a cause effect of radical upheavals and ideological destabilization during that period. The persistence, expansion and re-articulation of this discourse have been connected with the ongoing performance of a cultural and political critique from the feminist African American third world, gay, lesbian, and other positions self-identified as marginal or capable of being so regarded. About that history, I have no particular entitlement to speak, nor do I consider it subject to any attempt of mine to establish limits. What does interest me here is informing logic of marginal critique. Admittedly, the discourse of the marginal is not governed by any single pure or abstract logic. The term logic is suspect in this context on the account of its logocentric taint, and every case of marginal is a complex special case. Perhaps, however, it is part of my brief to suggest that this suspicion can become excessive or counterproductive. I shall at any rate recall that a rigorous systematic discourse of the marginal has been facilitated to a significant degree by what can still be called the logic or counter-logic of deconstruction. It was in deconstruction, particularly its earliest phase, that a key conceptual spatialization was affected such that center and margin become available as a term of radical critique. One might say that Derrida analytically elucidated this opposition, but then also theoretically represented it an object of deconstruction. On the one hand, this allows margin-center opposition to be identified and deconstructed with the culture, while on the other it permitted a development of the rhetorical strategies for the articulation of the subversive discourse, including a counter-philosophical discourse from the margin. Without that conceptualization, it is doubtful that any conference could be held or a journal issue produced under the rubric redefining marginality. In the initial phase, the main force of deconstruction was directed at the metaphysical centricism, a phallocentrism or Western discourse, while implying solidarity with marginalized individuals, communities, and culture, and deconstructive critique took aim at the production in a traditional Western discourse, and from the putative center of a set of valorized opposition in which the marginal term was always devalued. The critique of this form of culture centricism depends less on reclaiming or trying to articulate marginal discourse than on disclosing the ontological groundlessness or more precisely the essential non-difference of whatever might be opposed on that axis of culture, value and privilege. This was the critique that could culminate in the assertion that the margins is the center. The margin is the center. Take, for example, the masculine-feminine antithesis. As a metaphysical construction, in this construction, the feminine is posited as a marginal and lacking with the reference to the masculine. Deconstructing this opposition does not merely show that there is no ontological ground difference between the masculine and feminine. In the deconstructive view, this oppositional construction of the feminine actually betrays the masculine and constitutively lacking. Astridness thus ceased to be the form of lack that castricize women only. If that condition obtained, it does so universally as the symbolic condition. In other words, the metaphysical decentered, deficient and non-essential character of the feminine does not differentiate it from the masculine, but rather make it scandalously betraying double of the masculine. Is this possible to say that the feminine is the masculine? Once this critique had been affected, or concurrently with it, it became possible to recognize that metaphysical distinction, however groundless, have material consequences and self-fulfilling prophecies. The arbitrary application of the political power, including discursive power, throughout Western history would reciprocally have ratified the culture's metaphysical distinctions by marginalizing, censoring, and devaluing what was always already stipulated to be marginal, including the feminine and cultural align. The deconstructive exposure of this arbitrary power, always in process of rendering itself invisible, opened the way to theoretical effect, increasingly varied and increasingly historicized discourse by and of the marginalized. It also cleared the way of the more positive, independent representations of what had hitherto been the negatively characterized feminine and culturally aligned. Attempted positive characterization are not my concern here. Only the discourse of the marginal as opposed to the center is at issue. It may nonetheless need to be said, not for the first time, that the discourse of the marginal or the hitherto marginalized has its own risk. These include the risk of the revised positivism or essentializing oppositions from the side of the marginal and prematurely celebrating differences rather than continuing to deconstruct differences. These are not, however, the logical limit I have in mind. Only attempt risk calling of critical vigilance. Attempted positive characterization are not my concern here. Only the discourse of the marginal as opposed to the center is at issue. It may nonetheless need to be said, not for the first time, that the discourse of the marginal or hitherto marginalized has its own risk. This includes the risk of revived positivism, re-essentializing opposition from the side of the marginal and prematurely celebrating difference rather than continuing to deconstruct difference. These are not, however, the logical limit I have in mind, but only attendant risk calling for critical vigilance. I want to begin raising the question of limit by way of an example. The example is well-known, brilliant essay by Stephen Greenblatt, published in 1978, Marlowe, Marx and Anti-Semitism. 1978, Marlowe, Marx and Anti-Semitism. This essay illustrates not only the radical force of deconstruction at that time, but also the compatibility of the deconstruction in that phase with a certain Marxist radicalism. In Marlowe, Jew of Malta, according to Greenblatt, the Jew Barabbas and to lesser extent the small Jew community of the Malta are presented at marginal with reference to the Christian community at the self-defining center of positive value. A set of traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes initially structure the play and pious provoke the Christian, and these include stereotypical opposition between Jew and Machiavelli as a ruthless materialist and savage individualist on the one hand, and Christian and transcendent human and goodly on the other, partly because of the demystifying intrusion of the Turkish Muslim. This party, the opposition, collapsed to the reveal that the single ground of the play representation is material one. Simultaneously, gold is revealed to be the universal motor driving the action and corrosive solvent of the valorized metaphysical opposition of the play. A green blot eventually puts the true emblem, the society of the play is the slave market. Men are literally tuned into alienable, saleable object, and this level of society, the religious and political barriers fall away. The Jew buys the Turk at the Christian slave market. The Jew buys a Turk at the Christian slave market. It's mainly through the subversive figure of the Barbas, the Jew knight of the non-being, as Greenblatt wittingly call him, that the metaphysical category of being is deconstructed in the play. At the same time, it becomes possible to say in terms very close to those of Marx in his pamphlet on the Jewish question and Jew, the Christian. In other words, not only does the Christian community of the play fail to establish its own metaphysical differences from the Jews, one optimized by the Barbas, become the representative figure of the play as a whole, and thus of the so-called Christian community as well. An annihilating shift in the self-identification of the Elizabethan audience must be presumed to occur as playwright surrogate. Moreover, Barbas is the figure with whom Marlowe as marginal author seems most closely identified. So far good. However, one feature of the Greenblatt essay is that I have felt left out of the count. He also deals, might seem fitting, with Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, a near contemporary play not just structured by the opposition similar to those of the Jew of Malta, but even more systematically oppositional in the structure that Marlowe's play. As it turned out, Greenblatt used the Merchant of Venice in several ways as a buffer against of the Marlowe's savagely corrosive deconstruction as a supposedly uncontaminated a vantage point from which the scandalous unsavviness Marlowe theoretical use of the anti-Semitism for which the matter can be disowned and representation in which opposition are not collapsed but shored up. What might seem to be promised by all this is a different rational rather than indifferent logic or theoretical formulated limited the logic of the Jew of Malta. It appears to me, however, that neither a different logic nor a theoretical limit emerge from Greenblatt's discussion. Instead, Shakespeare is reinstated as the supreme authority figure, now called upon a section the arbitrary conservation of differences, the denial of the underlying identities, and the remytholization of the real material privilege as one of metaphysical value through the figure of Portia. Shylock, despite his token incorporation in the play, Christian's dispensation of the so-called mercy remain of the Greenblatt as scapegoat figure through whom arbitrary difference can be conserved not just in the play but on behalf of the self-incorporating critic and reader. I consider this outcome disappointing for the two reasons. First, it avoids the question of the self-fulfilling culture prophecy that is so conspicuous in the Shakespeare's treatments of the culturally alike. No final emancipation of the stereotypical wicked Jew and community that constitute him in the opposition of self occur in the play, any more than it does with the stereotypical black man in the Titius Andronicus or Othello. The not exactly savory issue of the self-perpetuating cultural structure and differences arbitrarily conservative in the final analysis is thus left unexamined. Second, Greenblatt's argument implicitly reinstates a radical conservative antithesis between Marlowe and Shakespeare, but then also temporal succession from Marlowe to Shakespeare. Of course, the Marlowe-Shakespeare antithesis predates Greenblatt's essay and has lent itself on occasion to lively attempts to reverse priorities in the Marlowe's favor. Yet the idea of inexorable succession, which also predates Greenblatt's essay, regularly supervenes and does occur apparently an ending need of a Shakespeare to save appearance. Moreover, this putative succession can now all too easily be read as allegorically sanctioned for the ascendancy of the conservative centricism in our all political and professional discourse. I should like to suggest here, however, that the question of another logic does not have to be avoided or backed in this way. I take this to be the case even when defense and conservative resistance come out into the poem open. That they will do so is to be expected when any discourse of the marginal will do so in the expected when the discourse of the marginal like Marlowe, and like that of the militant deconstruction, seems to be precipitating a general crisis of the non-difference, which is also one of the non-identity, whatever promise of the radical liberations that situate may hold for the marginalized. It will widely be apprehended as a threat to individual and cultural construction. What follow may be no more than a defensive reflex or arbitrary reinstatement of the differences. But those are not the only possibility. A threatened collapse of the difference may, for example, be regarded as a condition, a sacrificial crisis, calling of the restatement of effective scapegoat mechanism. Yet, a different logic from that of the endless radical subversion or restorative scapegoating may also begin to emerge. Insofar as we call it a logic, we will see it embodying putative general principle rather than just a defensive reflex. To clarify this somehow abstract proportion, but also to pursue the issue substantively, I shall here introduce my next example, and it is not unrelated to the previous one. In 1983, 5 years after the Greenblatt's essay appeared, Margaret Ferguson published the book called Trials of Desire. In that book, she surveyed various Renaissance humanist defense of poetry, culminating in the Sydney's defense. She also concluded any assimilating the Renaissance problematic of the poetic defense to Freud's problematic of the defense and a reparation in the construction of the individual subject. Notwithstanding significance in the present context, a discussion takes up issues of Freud as a Jew confronted not just because but the traditional anti-Semitic prejudice, but by the resistance of many academics, science who member of the Nazi Party. In her discussion of the Freud's career and thematic of the defense, Ferguson partially articulate another, perhaps supplementary logic for which the Greenblatt essays seems to call. So now this is the first part of this essay, and we will be uploading it as a part 1. And now after that you have to follow part 2. Maybe I will be able to make it another part 2 also. So you just come to this essay again and again, and this is very significant because this paragraph has been the part of your syllabus also. We have already done Sydney's defense of poetry, okay, and this trial of desire, that Margaret Ferguson's we can read, and that's how this is the how this deconstruction is being taken here. So I end my video here. Thanks for watching it and giving your appreciation.